Hello and welcome to another Top Grades Made Easy video. Our analysis of The Ghost of Christmas Past is going to help us understand the novel fully, because Dickens relies so much on the symbolism of this strange ghost. It's difficult to decide what Dickens wants us to make of this bizarre ghost. In The Flickering Light, this contrast between light and darkness, it mimics the action of a candle flame, which is why it's animated like that. But this also suggests the Christian symbolism of light and darkness, the battle between good and evil, fighting for Scrooge's soul. But now let's look at this other description. Being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, and now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body. Now that doesn't feel very Christian at all. It's quite shocking. These are dismembered body parts. Some critics claim that this is because the ghost is made up of the memories of many different people. It's also horrific being described as a series of dismembered body parts, even a head without a body, and perhaps this is a warning of death to our protagonist, Scrooge, if he doesn't change his ways. The Victorians had a name for this idea, and it was a Latin phrase, Memento mori, which meant remember you must die. And so just the visual appearance of this ghost acts as a memento mori, telling Scrooge to change his ways because his soul will be doomed to hell if he doesn't. Just as Jacob Marley's ghost suggested. We might argue that the speed of this shape-shifting, which Dickens emphasises with the repetition of now and now and now, conveys the speed at which his life is nearing its end. His life might be snuffed out. Throughout all the description of him, we can recognise aspects of a candle. Notice how the limbs suddenly melted away. And this allusion to a candle is also a Christian symbol. This is literally why candles are lit in church, to emphasise God's light and therefore salvation. A wider literary allusion is to the candle symbolising the brevity of life. Those of you who've studied Macbeth will know what I mean. A candle lasts a very little time, burns brightly, and then returns to darkness. This reminds a Victorian reader of another Latin phrase, Carpe diem, or seize the day. It means make the most of today's short time because tomorrow may never arrive. Both ideas are very relevant to Scrooge's experience with the ghosts, because they want him to change his ways before tomorrow. Time is short. The next quotation Dickens makes deliberately humorous. Scrooge then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. Your welfare, said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. This is the kind of middle-aged joke that actually Dickens' readers might well have been thinking. It also reveals his complete lack of fear of the ghost. Scrooge is a man of courage, and it's important that Dickens establishes that relationship so that we can partly sympathise with Scrooge. He's not entirely a hateful figure. One benefit of being obsessed by money and being so successful at it is that it has given Scrooge a great sense of certainty and self-worth. Now that's important because the reader is going to be relatively well off compared to other people in society, simply because of the price of this book, and Dickens is going to want to attack their own sense of security and self-worth with the novel. This is quite a subtle trick. It makes us identify with Scrooge's sense of humour because he wants his readers to find something in common with Scrooge. By the end of the chapter, Scrooge will have lost all his composure and will actually physically attack the ghost, which is what this image from the original text is conveying. And that transformation in Scrooge is perhaps aimed at making his readers wonder if they should also change and shed some of their self-confidence in the face of others' poverty, as we'll see later in the novel. Because a typical Victorian reader would probably be certain that the poor were undeserving of charity, just as Scrooge is certain that they don't deserve charity. The whole idea of workhouses was that the poor deserved their poverty because they just didn't work hard enough to get themselves out of poverty. So now let's look at the symbolism of Scrooge trying to put out the light of the Ghost of Christmas Past. The ghost looks so much like a candle that Scrooge believes he can be extinguished. Why does he want to put it out? It is because he can't bear to confront his past. Scrooge's distress is psychologically very convincing. Now, this is important in a novel that's written before the invention of the study of psychology. Dickens is really delving into why Scrooge behaves like he does as a man by getting us to focus right at the beginning of the novel on his past, his childhood. The child is the father to the man. The causes of his being a miser and heartless are in his childhood. So just before this moment, he can't bear to see Belle happy with her new family because he knows that family could have been his family, if only he had loved her better. Dickens uses it to tell his readers that they should examine their own pasts. Being able to trace the causes of their prejudices and their changes in personality from innocence to experience is necessary if they want to change. Once we know why we behave as we do, we are in a better position to change the behaviours which are damaging us. The role of the Ghost of Christmas Past is obviously to help us understand Scrooge and sympathise with him. But Dickens also wants us to understand ourselves by thinking more about our own pasts and not acting as Scrooge is doing here, trying to obliterate that past so that he doesn't have to think about those painful memories that shaped him. Dickens tries to show us that we can't obliterate that past with the symbolism of the light that cannot be put out. He could not hide the light which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. This is why he portrays Scrooge as powerless here. In contrast, the power of the light is conveyed with streamed in the unbroken flood. This implies that Scrooge will be overwhelmed like a flood overwhelmed the earth in the story of Noah. And the juxtaposition of the symbolism of light with the symbolism of the flood is deliberately a biblical allusion here to suggest that God is working through the power of the ghosts and giving Scrooge a second chance. Now, many readers often point to the eventual conversion in Stave 5 where Scrooge turns out to be a wonderful guy, and they say this is totally unconvincing, Dickens. But no, Dickens is trying to prepare that ground even here by suggesting that the flood of light will overcome Scrooge's misanthropy, his hatred of people. Another bizarre part of his description is this. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished to a child's proportions. It's easy to see the ghost as a kind of reflection of Scrooge through time, being at the same time like a child and like an old man, but there is more to it. He is also diminished to a child's proportions. This reminds us that childhood itself is important, not just Scrooge's childhood. In other words, this is the psychological truth of the character, where Dickens is asking us to revisit the experiences of our own childhood again. It symbolises how we all carry this child's experiences within us, and we're not aware of how it's affecting us. Scrooge becomes aware through the Ghost of Christmas Past. If you type Dickens Blacking Factory into Google Images, you will get images from Dickens' traumatic youth. We can imagine that Dickens was totally aware of the impact of childhood on people, especially through childhood trauma. He recreated his own childhood poverty, which we can see here, in two novels, Great Expectations and David Copperfield, as major parts of his plot. And this is because he understood the psychology, even though the study of psychology, as I've said, wasn't really invented actually till the 1870s. And it suggests he wants his readers desperately to go through a similar psychological journey to the one that Scrooge is going through with the Ghost of Christmas Past. From this we can grow to understand what causes our current behaviours and attitudes, just as Scrooge does. Only then can a reader hope to change any which are undesirable. Now that's so important to Dickens because he wants those readers to change. The original cover of the novel doesn't look so special now, but it was priced at 5 shillings. That's a third of the week's salary for a worker like Bob, and hugely expensive for the time. In fact, he only printed 6,000 copies. What does that mean? It means that he was aiming this book at 6,000 very well-off readers. Those are the people who had money like Scrooge, who could change the lives of Londoners. Now, this kind of context is so useful to you in arguing what Dickens' purpose is, which is not simply to entertain. He does actually want to change the lives of the poor. Now, this childlike vision of the ghost is also a reference to the Christkindl, a German tradition for Christmas, where instead of the modern Father Christmas type figure, you had a childlike figure who gave out the presents on Christmas Day. And if you search for Christkindl 19th century, you'll see that the images become increasingly more childlike. And the reason this German symbolism is so relevant is that Queen Victoria had 3 years ago just married Prince Albert, a German prince, and German Christmas traditions like the Christmas tree were becoming popular in Victorian England. So Dickens is buying into the hype of the moment. Now you will notice that this kind of shape-shifting from child to man is exactly what happens to Scrooge at the end of Stave 5, when he says, "I'm like a baby." And it's also the sort of behaviour that Bob Cratchit gives us when he runs home at Christmas Eve and plays on the children's slide for so long. We can also see it in the childlike enthusiasm of Fred for his parlour games like Blind Man's Buff. Behaving like a child is central to Dickens' message. He uses the Ghost of Christmas Past to show that we should embrace our inner child even as we reach the state of middle and old age men. I'm not sure which one is most like me. I hope it's that one, but my wife would probably say that. Which one looks like your dad? Because most of Dickens' readers were devout Christians, he has to use a lot of Christian symbolism. Here we're going to look at the image of the fall, the experience of Adam and Eve eating of the forbidden fruit. Notice that it is not, and has never been, an apple. So this is the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And because of this crime against God's instructions, Adam and Eve are expelled from Eden, and they never get to eat from the other tree, the tree of eternal life. Yes, Adam and Eve could have become immortal, but because they sinned in this way, and this is the biblical explanation for why we are all mortal. So right at the beginning, Scrooge rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped his robe in supplication. "I am a mortal," Scrooge remonstrated, "and liable to fall." Well, obviously he means to fall crashing down to earth when they fly off, but he uses this language to deliberately remind us of the original fall of Adam and Eve. "Bear but a touch of my hand there," said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, "and you shall be upheld in more than this." First, Scrooge clasped his robe in supplication. This is the kind of language we use to describe people kneeling down to pray. On the one hand, this reminds us of the idea of Christian salvation, but on the other hand, the image is unsettling. This is a reference to Jesus. He was given a very fine robe as he went to trial with Pontius Pilate before he was crucified. The robe was given to him as a kind of mockery. So the robe is also a symbol of Jesus' sacrifice, death, and rebirth. This image of rebirth is echoed at the end of the stave when Scrooge cannot put out the light. It becomes, if you like, symbolically reborn, just as Jesus' light could not be put out by death. However, it isn't the Christian imagery, I think, which convinces Scrooge to make this leap and fly off with the ghost. It is instead the ghost's very human action, laying a hand upon Scrooge's chest over his heart to calm him. He's asking Scrooge to really feel the memories of the past. That's why he concentrates on the heart. That's what it means symbolically. He needs Scrooge to reconnect with his childhood self in order to experience the joy he had as a child. But he also needs Scrooge to remember the serial abandonments which have caused his desperate attraction to money and his refusal to spend it even on himself. Revisiting these memories of his dead sister Fan and Belle, who's actually rejected him because he appeared to prefer money to her, is too painful for Scrooge at this stage, and he yells out, "Haunt me no longer!" This is interesting because although Scrooge meets many ghosts in the play, this is the only one he thinks of as haunting him. Dickens does this to show that it is our pasts which quite literally haunt all of us. All our mistakes and our unhappy memories and our experiences are all in the past, and we try to obliterate them and hide away from those mistakes. This is the only ghost who doesn't try to show Scrooge the experiences of any other people. He's really just trying to show Scrooge the experience of people and himself from his past. In this way, Dickens is pointing out the psychological truth that we can only become better people if we fully examine our own pasts. Now, a normal morality tale might just revisit Scrooge's past mistakes and cruelty, but Dickens is much more sophisticated than that. Instead, he asks us, like Scrooge, to examine those formative experiences and emotions which shape the personality of the self. It's not really the things that Scrooge does wrong that start to affect him. It's the injustices that he suffered when he was a child, abandoned by his father, presumably abandoned by his mother in death because she never features, then abandoned in death by Fan, his gorgeous sister, and then abandoned by Belle, who breaks off their engagement. His whole past is about a series of abandonments, and he realizes now that he is responsible for making choices which will deliberately lead to further abandonment. This is the pattern of attachment that he's locked into and needs to break, and at the end of this stave he can't do it. It's too painful an idea, and he tries to snuff out the power of the ghost. When Scrooge asks, "Why do you delight to torture me?" what Dickens really means is that if we're not thinking about our pasts as painful, we haven't really understood it properly. We have to revisit those moments in our past that we don't want to shed a light on, and only then will we understand how our future behaviour has been influenced by those memories, and how we can then change our behaviour by looking at those memories through a different light. Here Dickens also suggests that this self-examination is the hardest part of our journey towards self-discovery. Scrooge expresses it as a kind of agony, which is emphasised by his violent reaction to the ghost. And through the ghosts he implies that we too must stop saying this and actually face our past selves in order to learn how to change our own behaviours. This is psychologically true on a personal level, but also on a social level, because it is the wealthy reader who is going to change his behaviour towards charity, towards helping their employees in their business, and transforming lives. And if you want to get top marks on any essay on the whole novel, check out 2 of the videos, appearing here and here. Spooky.